Good morning or evening. Let's talk about the New Deal, shall we? And let's get right into it. We wouldn't have a New Deal if we didn't have a Great Depression. And I'm not going to go into the causes of the Depression. It's like the depressions that we've talked about before. It's things that were internal to the United States, weaknesses in our economy, but it's also the shape of the international economy as well. And then it's decisions we made in response to kind of economic downturns internationally. I'll talk more about that in our World War II lecture. But a couple things I do want to highlight about the Great Depression in America and just kind of how it was felt. Worst depression in our history, the Panic of 1893 had seen 20% unemployment average nationwide. Great Depression would see 25% unemployment, but understand that that was uneven, just like the Great Recession in our own time, just like the COVID recession of 2020 and possibly 21, I guess. It's felt uneven. Some states and some parts of states, employment remains high. In other places, it's much worse. In the Great Recession, some states saw declining unemployment. Others saw, like Michigan, saw record, high unemployment, should I say, not record compared to the Great Depression. The Depression, you saw some people that were below 25%. You had other parts and other states, other parts of the country that saw 80% or higher, even 100%. And so depressions are never uniform. When you hear that statistic, 25% unemployed, understand that certain parts of America and certain parts of the economy are getting hurt worse than others. And that's just as true today as it was then. The weakest parts of your economy, and at this time that was agricultural sector, was really taking it on the chin. The other thing I'll say is, understand this isn't just a purely economic catastrophe, it's a social one. Unemployment means more than just simply you're out of a job, particularly when there is no social insurance at this time. There's no, banking insurance. So the Great Depression was more than just simply an unemployment crisis. It was a social and cultural crisis. As the Great Depression just uprooted communities, entire communities of Americans, particularly in the agricultural sector, and we're talking about millions of Americans who were made not just jobless, but they were made landless as they were kicked off of their land, particularly sharecroppers. And as they were kicked off of their land and went in search of work and couldn't find work in their state, and they began traveling around states, understand that millions of Americans in the 1930s became stateless, disconnected from their state, disconnected from the national government, from the national population. The Great Depression, in other words, was more than just a kind of simple economic phenomenon. It saw the destruction of communities. It saw millions of people being made jobless, landless, and stateless. Who was going to fix a problem like the Great Depression? Herbert Hoover, we'll see as you go through this lecture and as you read in the textbook, Hoover is doing things to combat the Depression, but it seemed too little, too late, or at least the image was that he was the do-nothing president. And so he became increasingly unpopular as we moved towards the 1932 elections. Meanwhile, FDR, little cousin of Teddy Roosevelt, his star continues to rise, and FDR is elected in 1932 on the promise that, as Teddy had promised a square deal for Americans, FDR is now promising a new deal for Americans. He promises to get into office and to immediately to begin combating this depression, fighting it like an enemy and making war on the Depression. What we want to do in this lecture is talk about what's new and what's old about the New Deal. In this first part of the lecture, we'll focus on what's old about the New Deal. The New Deal was seen as, an experimentation. It was seen as, all these things that we've never done before. We're going to do now. We're going to use all these things we've been talking about now for a while. We're going to institute these things. The reality was the New Deal and the New Dealers, the so-called Brains Trust, drew upon past experience and drew upon their past experience in government. And that's certainly the case with the centerpiece of the New Deal, the National Industrial Recovery Act, which gave birth to the NRA, not the National Rifle Administration, the National Recovery Administration. The NIRA did create public works programs too. We'll talk about those more in the next lecture. The Progress Works Administration, and then eventually the Works Progress Administration after 1935. But the centerpiece of the New Deal for Roosevelt and for his brain trusters was the NIRA and specifically the NRA. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details of the NRA. Frankly, I'm going to try to make this part of the lecture unusually short. I know you're all sad about that. But honestly, this is covered in the Gerstle textbook, so I'd like you to get your details in the NIRA and the NRA from there. A couple things that I will say about the NRA. First, it is a part of the old New Deal. As you read through Gerstle, one of the points that he'll be making is the philosophy of the NRA of business cooperation and government and business cooperation is something that grew out of World War I, and we've talked about this in the World War I lecture. The War Industries Board and its idea of trade associations became a model that the New Dealers took up and tried to institute now in peacetime in the NRA. But the philosophy was a business and government cooperation. The image I like to think of is rather than Roosevelt the trust buster, that the government under the NRA was trying to act as cheerleader for business. Government would help businesses cooperate with each other to set prices and distribution and wages and all these kinds of things. And through a kind of scientific cooperation, businesses would be able to solve their own problems and get America out of the Depression, and government would just kind of be there to kind of rubber stamp all the different policies that business came up with, and government would be there kind of as the cheerleader. Okay. So this is what I would, the centerpiece of the New Deal, in other words, is drawing upon the past experiences of World War I and Hoover's own philosophy of associationalism. So it's part of the old New Deal. Second, the NRA is a good example of how the New Deal is a psychological success, but an actual failure. You'll read in Gerstle that the NRA was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1935. So it's no sooner than it's up and running in 1933 than it's shut down in 1935. A lot of people were saying, thank God, because the evidence was it wasn't working. That businessmen the codes that they were coming up with were not just working that well, and there was some evidence that the NRA was actually making the Depression worse from a financial from an economic standpoint. It's not working, so a lot of people were happy to see it go, and yeah, I mean, they were angry at the Supreme Court. They claimed it was overreach and everything, for striking down something that was passed by Congress, but nevertheless, a lot of people were happy to see it go. It wasn't working. And that's true of a lot of the New Deal policy, or you might have learned this in school, right? Coach said, the New Deal doesn't bring us out of the Great Depression, which is absolutely true. But that would just simply stop there, would to miss all the successes that the New Deal was. The NRA, for as much as it was an actual failure, its philosophy of associationalism did not work. The propaganda campaign that was a part of the NRA, the Blue Eagle, the slogan, "We do our part" in businesses, giving these posters that they can kind of put up. The New Deal and Roosevelt and its messaging, whether it's Roosevelt using the radio or the NRA putting out all these posters and pins for people to wear, it flooded American society with images and presidential words at a time in which the country was really adrift, and they needed some kind of centering force. And it turns out that centering force was the federal government, in this case the NRA propaganda, and Roosevelt's own use of radio. As Roosevelt would say in his first inaugural, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And at a time in which America was maybe never more fearful for its future, not just its prosperity, but for its stability. Roosevelt and agencies like the NRA were at least able to give the illusion, not the reality, they were at least able to give the illusion that somebody's trying. Somebody's fighting on my behalf. Roosevelt, he might not be having an immediate effect on my pocketbook, but he's out there fighting for me. He's doing something. And that gave people hope at a time in which there was very little reason to hope. So understand the New Deal is a psychological success, and even the NRA, as a terrible failure as it was, its propaganda campaign was a help to Americans to keep them hopeful that better days were ahead and that somebody was fighting on their behalf. Final point I want to make is the NRA also shows how, in some cases, the New Deal, as we'll call it, came out of the old New Deal. So let's talk about Section 7A. And Gerstle will talk a little bit about this too, but I'll make sure that we hit on this because it is a part of the New Deal that I'll talk about in the next lecture. 7A provided for collective bargaining rights, meaning the rights of workers to join labor unions. This was kind of an aside. This was not the centerpiece of the NRA. The NRA centerpiece was what businesses and their managers and CEOs were going to be doing together. But to help out workers during this time too, Section 7A provided for unionism. It provided collective bargaining rights. And you begin to see, after a time of the 1920s of a time known as generally in labor history as welfare capitalism. There was a labor union in the 1920s, the American Federation of Labor, a national labor union, but it represented a more exclusive, more exclusive class of workers, and most of the immigrants, most immigrant class workers, unskilled workers, were not a part of it. And so they had to rely upon corporations for welfare until those programs began failing in the late 20s and 30s. And then where are these workers looking to? Well, increasingly, they want to look to themselves and form independent labor unions independent of federal government, labor unions independent of corporations themselves. They wanted to form an independent labor movement. Section 7A, in some ways, gave impetus to that. And so a new organization that you might have heard of before, the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, begins to take off in the midst of the Depression under this federal government protection, Section 7A. Well, of course, when the NRA is thrown out by the Supreme Court, Section 7A is thrown out by the Supreme Court. So what of labor protections now? Can workers still join labor unions and not be harassed by or fired by their employers? Legally, that's up in the air. And it's up in the air at a time in which you really don't want it to be up in the air. Gerstle will write about this too. 1934, 1935, we're seeing an unprecedented strike wave in America. Tens of thousands, even possibly hundreds of thousands of workers from all different kinds of industries are going on strike. With their upset about the continuing economic crisis and their continuing economic hardship, and the continuing resistance, frankly, of employers to them forming labor unions. And so FDR in 1935 finds himself not unlike where his cousin Teddy Roosevelt found himself back in the early decades of the 20th century, with a pretty vibrant socialist party. This is the early 20th century. A pretty vibrant socialist party, Labor unions such as the Industrial Workers of the World, which were not opposed to using violence to advance their aims or anarchy. And just a fear that workers were kind of going to break off and do their own thing. Franklin Roosevelt now finds himself in 1934 and 1935 facing the same thing. Are workers about to separate themselves off from the government, from the economy, and really kind of build up a revolutionary force in America? Certainly the Communist Party in the United States and America was very eager to see that happen. I'm not sure if Gerstle will use this term, but certainly you'll have a section in that chapter extensively on the CIO and the Popular Front. The 1930s has been known in American history as the Red Decade. Communists and socialists will not see great electoral successes. The Communist Party of the United States will never be bigger than 100,000 members, but their influence in labor unions was probably never greater than during these years. And so Roosevelt's a little freaked out. And so just as the NRA collapses in 1935, something needs to replace it. You'll see, parts of the NRA get kind of piecemeal repackaging. So the Public Works Administration was part of the NRA Public Works program. That shut down. It's replaced almost immediately by the Works Progress Administration because there was a need for it, as we'll talk about in the next lecture. Something that will come to kind of replace Section 7A as a part of the New Deal will come in 1935, the Wagner Act. Bet you're happy to stop seeing that little guy jumping there. The Wagner Act, don't ask me to do that jumping. The Wagner Act of 1935, otherwise known as the National Labor Relations Act, or the NLRA. The NLRA essentially does what Section 7A of the NRA had done, which is provide for collective bargaining rights for American workers. The CIO and its head, John Lewis, went a little bit further than just saying government is, telling workers government is protecting your right to form labor unions. CIO propaganda actually said Roosevelt wants you to join a labor union. It's probably going a little too far. But Roosevelt would, but it's true that the CIO would kind of capitalize on the Wagner Act to say, look, the federal government wants you to join a labor union more than just it's protecting your right to join a labor union. So the Wagner Act, the NLRA, would, to that point in American history, it was the most significant piece of labor legislation. And in some ways remains so today. It's going to be gutted in 1948 by the 1947 by the Taft-Hartley Act. I think you'll be reading about that in Gerstle. Gerstle's a labor historian, so he's really kind of tracking the story of unionization and the rise and the decline of unionization in some ways in this story. But the Wagner Act is a significant turning point away from a corporate sector which actively resisted labor unions and a government which largely sided with corporations to a government that is now affirming the rights of workers, all workers, not just skilled workers, not just white, well, still predominantly white workers, as you read about, but not. It's not Northern Protestant, right? It's Italians and Jews can join labor unions now. It's not just for the Germans and the Irish. So a much more multi-ethnic labor union movement will grow out of the Wagner Act. So it is a significant part of the New Deal. And I would say if you want to make this kind of part one of what's new about the New Deal, is government protection of unions. If not government encouragement of unions. I used the word affirm, and I used it intentionally. You guys know you're born into an anti-affirmative action age, right? Affirmative action, well, that's reverse discrimination, right? Why promote the rights of minorities or women when, white men are out there working hard and and being discriminated against? I mean, you hear all these kind of things. If you haven't encountered controversies or arguments over affirmative action, go talk to your parents or grandparents about it, okay? We need to remember a time in which, as one historian of the New Deal has put it, affirmative action was white. Affirmative action was not a policy, a racial policy or a gender policy like it would become in the 60s and 70s. Affirmative action began as affirmative action largely for white people, particularly for the white workers of the AFL and the CIO. In fact, that phrase, affirmative action, was first used in American legal history in the National Labor Relations Act, where government is given the authority to, quote, actively affirm the rights of unionized workers. In other words, when we attack affirmative action as this kind of reverse racism, we forget a long history of government providing protections or privileges or rights for white people. And so if this is something you would explore further, I would invite you to pick up a copy of Katznelson's book and check that out. You could even possibly make it an extra credit assignment if you want to. The other thing I'll say about the Wagner Act and just the New Deal's overall approach towards labor. I'm talking a little bit about this in one of the sections, that it's during the New Deal that they will push not just the rights of labor, but a particular vision of labor. It's during the New Deal that the federal government actively, through propaganda, through its support for certain art, will actively push, well, what we would call in the 80s and 90s family values, the idea of the husband who works and the wife who stays at home and raises the 2.5 kids, is something that the New Deal is actually pushing that ideal. As the New Deal is trying to stop what they see as a dangerous trend increasingly during the Depression, it's men who are unemployed and it's women who are being employed. Employers are increasingly wanting to hire women. In fact, 25% of the workforce by 1940 would be women. Employers were wanting to hire women because they didn't have to pay them as much as they paid men. Because the belief was female labor was compensatory. It was supplemental to male income. And so women were not paid as much, even if they were doing the same job as men. And the New Deal did not like that trend. And so they supported art. They put out posters themselves, like the WPA, that show men in these, manly, strenuous, if you will, visions of doing the hard work, and women largely as domestic kind of laborers. So even this idea of the nuclear family and the man who works outside of the home, the breadwinner ideal, and the woman who stays at home to take care of the kids and take care of the man. This is a cultural ideal, but not necessarily one that just is automatically self-replicating, right? Every generation has to kind of decide to invest in it or not. And in the midst of the Great Depression, it was government itself putting out propaganda saying that men should be out there working and women should be staying at home, even though in many cases the reverse was happening. Men couldn't find work, and women could, because they would not be paid as much by corporations. So it's important to understand the New Deal in not just its kind of economic and political forms, but also in its racial and gender forms too. And Gerstle is going to help you really kind of bring that out. All right, we will continue talking about what's new about the New Deal in the next part of the lecture.